The Arizona Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a merciless August sun. Dust devils spiraled across the barren landscape like ghosts searching for something that had died long ago. In the ramshackle town of Copper Ridge, weathered, buildings leaned against each other as if afraid to stand alone. Paint peeled from storefronts, revealing gray wood beneath that had given up trying to look respectable years earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Main Street buzzed with the kind of restless energy that came before something ugly happened. Men clustered in groups, their voices carrying the sharp edge of liquor and boredom. Sweat stained their shirts dark despite the early hour. They spat tobacco juice into the dirt and wiped their mouths with the backs of calloused hands, eyes scanning the crowd for entertainment. At the far end of the street, a makeshift platform had been erected overnight. Rough planks nailed together, without care for craftsmanship, splinters jutting out like accusations. The wood bore stains that could have been anything: blood, whiskey, tears. Nobody asked. The platform stood 3 feet high, just enough to ensure everyone could see what was being sold. A brass bell hung from a crooked post, its surface green with age and neglect. When the auctioneer struck it with a bent spoon, the sound cracked. Across the square like a whip, men turned their heads toward the noise, conversations dying as anticipation thickened the air. The auctioneer was a thin man named Cornelius Wickham, his face narrow and pointed like a rat's. His vest hung loose on his frame, and gold teeth glinted when he smiled, which wasn't often and never meant anything good. He'd been selling cattle, horses, and occasionally people across 3 territories for the better part of 2 decades. Business was business, he always said, and sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Gentlemen," Wickham's voice pierced the morning air, "we have something special today. Something that'll make your ranches run smoother and your lives a whole lot easier." The crowd pressed closer, boots shuffling in the dirt. A few men laughed, but the sound held no warmth. It was the laughter of wolves circling prey. From the shadows beside the general store, they brought her out. She moved like someone walking in a dream or a nightmare. Her feet were bare, caked with dirt that spoke of long miles traveled without choice. The rough hemp sack over her head was secured with rope around her neck, not tight enough to strangle, but snug enough to remind her of her place. The fabric was stained with sweat and dust, and it moved slightly with each labored breath. Her hands were bound behind her back with leather straps that had rubbed her wrists raw. Despite this, she held herself with a dignity that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Her back was straight, her steps measured. Even blind and bound, she carried herself like royalty walking to a coronation rather than a slave walking to auction. The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted in crude comments and raucous laughter. Someone threw a clod of dirt that struck her shoulder. She didn't flinch. "Look at her," Wickham called out, climbing onto the platform. "Strong as an ox, twice as useful. She can cook, clean, tend animals, work the fields. And she's young enough to last you years." A voice from the crowd shouted, "How do we know she ain't diseased?" Wickham's grin widened. "Examine the merchandise all you want after you buy her, but I guarantee she's healthy. Look at how she stands. Ain't no sick woman got posture like that." Miles away from this scene, at the edge of the painted desert where the land turned from red clay to alkali flats, stood a ranch that had seen better decades. The Broken Wheel Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of stubborn earth that fought every attempt at civilization. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles, held upright more by habit than engineering. The barn roof sagged in the middle, patched with whatever materials could be scrounged: tin sheets, canvas, hope. The main house was a single-story structure built from adobe bricks that had been mixed with more prayers than straw. Windows were few and small, designed to keep out the brutal sun rather than welcome in light. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, its boards warped and weathered to the color of old bones. 2 rocking chairs sat there, though only one had been used in recent memory. Behind the house, a windmill creaked in the desert breeze, its blades spinning lazily as it drew water from a well that threatened to run dry with each passing season. A vegetable garden struggled to survive in a fenced plot, producing more dust than food despite the owner's persistent efforts. This was the domain of Thomas Franklin Garrett, though most folks just called him Frank when they bothered to call him anything at all. He'd inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier, along with its debts, its broken dreams, and its stubborn refusal to turn a profit. Frank was 32 years old and looked 40, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into endless horizons and finding them empty. His father, Samuel Garrett, had been a man of grand visions and poor judgment. He'd bought the land sight unseen from a railroad company back in '68, convinced that the coming railroad would make him rich. The railroad had come all right 40 miles to the south, making his property about as valuable as a bucket with no bottom. Samuel had tried everything: cattle ranching, sheep, goats, farming, even a brief stint at mining when someone claimed to have found silver in the nearby hills. The silver turned out to be fool's gold, the cattle died in a drought, and the sheep were taken by wolves. Samuel died of a heart attack in the spring of '79, leaving Frank with 500 acres of magnificent nothing and debts that stretched longer than the Colorado River. Frank had tried to make it work. God knew he'd tried. He'd sold off most of the cattle, keeping just enough to maintain the pretense of being a rancher. He'd planted crops that withered in the desert heat. He'd taken odd jobs in town, swallowing his pride along with the dust that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken country. The bank held notes on everything: the land, the house, what remained of the livestock. Marcus Thornfield, the bank president, had been patient, but patience had limits, and Frank could see he was approaching them fast. Thornfield's visits to the ranch had become more frequent, his manner more pressing. The man spoke in the careful language of someone delivering bad news while trying to sound reasonable. "Times are hard for everyone, Frank," Thornfield had said during his last visit 3 weeks earlier. "But I've got investors asking questions about properties that aren't producing revenue. You understand my position." Frank understood, all right. He understood that he was 3 months behind on payments and sinking deeper with each passing day. He understood that his neighbors had started looking at him with the mixture of pity and embarrassment reserved for men who'd outlived their luck. He understood that he was one disaster away from losing everything his family had worked to build, even if what they'd built wasn't much. The morning of the auction, Frank had ridden into Copper Ridge with his last $23 in his pocket and no clear plan for how to spend it. He'd thought maybe he could find day work, or perhaps someone would need help moving cattle. Anything to bring in a few dollars and buy him another month of pretending things might turn around. He hadn't planned on stopping at the auction. He'd heard the commotion and followed the sound out of curiosity more than anything else. Frank had seen slave auctions before. They weren't uncommon in the territories, despite what the law books said back east. He'd never participated, never approved, but he'd never actively opposed them either. In a place where survival was measured day by day, most folks didn't have the luxury of high principles, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way she stood despite everything that had been done to her. Maybe it was the silence that fell over the crowd when they brought her out, as if even these hardened men recognized something sacred being profaned. Or maybe it was just that Frank had reached the point where his own circumstances made him more sensitive to the suffering of others. The bidding started at $50, a hefty sum that drew serious interest from the wealthier ranchers in the crowd. Frank recognized most of them men who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of head of cattle, men for whom $50 was pocket change. $50. Called Out Bernard Hutchinson, owner of the Circle H Ranch. He was a large man with a beard that reached his chest and hands like ham hocks. His ranch employed 24 men and stretched across most of the valley north of town. 60, countered William Morrison, whose Double M brand was known throughout the territory. Morrison was thinner than Hutchinson, but twice as mean, with pale eyes that looked at people the same way he looked at livestock, evaluating their usefulness and calculating their cost. The woman on the platform stood motionless through it all. The sack over her head moved slightly with her breathing, but otherwise she might have been carved from stone. Frank found himself wondering what she was thinking, what she was feeling, if she understood what was happening, or if the language was foreign to her. 75. Hutchinson called out, his voice booming across the square. 80. Morrison shot back immediately. The crowd was enjoying the show. Men placed side bets on who would win, their voices growing louder and more excited as the price climbed. Frank noticed that none of them looked at the woman directly. She was a commodity to them, no different from a horse or a sack of grain. $100. The bid came from Edmund Carstairs, a newcomer to the territory who'd bought the old Peterson place and had money to burn. Carstairs was young, maybe 25, with soft hands and clothes that had never known honest work. His father owned textile mills back in Massachusetts, and Edmund had come west to play at being a rancher with Daddy's money. The bidding slowed. $100 was serious money, more than most working men saw in 6 months. Hutchinson and Morrison exchanged glances, each trying to read the other's intentions. 110. Morrison called out, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier. Carstairs smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. Frank had heard stories about Carstairs, none of them good. The man had a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond what was necessary, even in this harsh country. His hired hands didn't stay long, and those who left often bore scars that hadn't been there when they arrived. 125. Carstairs' voice rang clear and confident. Morrison shook his head and stepped back. Hutchinson spat in the dirt and crossed his arms, clearly out of the bidding. The crowd murmured with disappointment. They'd hoped for more drama. Wickham raised his gavel. $125 going once. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank's stomach turned. He'd heard the stories about what happened to Indian women on Carstairs' ranch. The man collected them like trophies, using them until they broke or tried to run. Those who ran were usually brought back to serve as examples to the others, going twice. Frank's hand moved to his pocket, fingers closing around the worn coins there. $23. Everything he had in the world. It wasn't enough to make a real bid, barely enough to buy supplies for a week. But something in the woman's posture, the dignity she maintained even in this degrading circumstance, spoke to something deep in his chest. His father had always said that a man's character was revealed not by how he treated his equals, but by how he treated those who couldn't fight back. Samuel Garrett had been a dreamer and a poor businessman, but he'd been a good man. Frank wondered what his father would do in this situation. The gavel began to fall. $1. Frank's voice cracked like a whip across the sudden silence. Every head in the crowd turned toward him. Wickham's gavel stopped in midair. Carstairs' face went red with rage and embarrassment. "What did you say?" Wickham demanded. Frank stepped forward, his legs feeling like water. Every eye in the square was on him now, and he could feel the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "I said $1. Laughter erupted from the crowd. Someone called out, "That ain't how auctions work, boy." Wickham's rat-like face twisted into a sneer. "The current bid is $125, son." "You can't just—" "Nobody else is bidding," Frank interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "You called for bids twice, and nobody spoke up." Seems to me the auction's open to new offers. Carstairs pushed through the crowd, his face purple with fury. You insolent piece of trash. I bid 125. And then the auctioneer called for additional bids, Frank replied. Twice, when nobody answered, I made an offer. The crowd had gone quiet again, sensing drama of a different sort. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about respect. About a broken-down rancher challenging his betters in front of the whole town. Wickham looked uncertain for the first time since Frank had known him. The auctioneer glanced between Carstairs and Frank, clearly calculating which decision would cause him less trouble in the long run. That's not how it works, Carstairs snarled, stepping closer to Frank. You can't just... Actually, interrupted a new voice. He's right. Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison Blackwood pushing through the crowd. Blackwood was one of the few honest officials in the territory, a man who'd come west not to escape the law but to help establish it. He was in his 60s, with white hair and a beard, but his eyes were sharp and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades settling disputes. The bidding had stalled, Blackwood continued, his gaze moving between Wickham and Carstairs. When an auctioneer calls going once, going twice, he's soliciting new bids. If new bids are offered before the gavel falls, they must be considered. Carstairs' face went from purple to white. Judge, you can't be serious. $1? It's insulting. The amount of the bid is irrelevant, Blackwood replied calmly. The process is what matters. Mr. Garrett made a legal bid before the gavel fell. Mr. Carstairs, you're welcome to counterbid if you wish. All eyes turned back to Carstairs. The young man's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched into fists. Frank could see the calculation in his eyes. Was it worth escalating this situation over a single woman, even one he'd clearly wanted? After a long moment, Carstairs spat in the dirt near Frank's boots. She ain't worth the trouble, he muttered. But his eyes promised that this wasn't over. Wickham looked around the crowd one more time, hoping someone else would jump in with a higher bid. When no one spoke, he shrugged and brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to Thomas Garrett for $1. The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about the strange turn of events. Some looked at Frank with amusement, others with disgust. Carstairs lingered for a moment, his pale eyes boring into Frank's, before turning and stalking away. Frank walked to the platform on unsteady legs, fishing the silver dollar from his pocket. His hand shook slightly as he placed it in Wickham's palm. You sure about this boy? The auctioneer asked quietly. That one's got spirit. Might be more trouble than she's worth. Frank looked up at the woman on the platform. Even with the sack over her head, even bound and helpless, she radiated a strength that he envied. We'll see, he said. Wickham untied the rope that secured her to the platform, but left her hands bound and the sack in place. She's your problem now, he said, handing Frank the lead rope. Good luck. Frank took the rope gently, surprised by how light it felt in his hand. The woman didn't resist as he let her down from the platform, but he could feel the tension in her body, the coiled energy of someone ready to fight or flee at the first opportunity. They walked through town in silence, Frank leading his horse, with one hand and holding her rope with the other. People stopped to stare as they passed. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others smirked as if they knew something Frank didn't. A few children followed them for a block or two before their mothers called them back. Frank had never felt more exposed in his life. Every step seemed to echo off the buildings around them, announcing to the world that he'd just bought a human being for the price of a good meal. The weight of what he'd done settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat, but when he glanced back at the woman walking behind him, he saw that same impossible dignity in her posture. Whatever else she wasn't broken. And somehow that made him feel like maybe he'd done the right thing, even if he wasn't sure what he was going to do next. The ride back to the Broken Wheel Ranch took 2 hours across terrain that seemed determined to punish anyone foolish enough to call it home. Frank rode his horse, a tired gelding named Dusty who'd seen better years, while the woman walked beside them. He'd offered to let her ride, gesturing toward the horse's back, but she'd shaken her head beneath the sack. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, turning the desert air into something you could almost chew. Heat waves rose from the baked earth, making the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. Frank found himself glancing back at his companion frequently, amazed that she kept pace without complaint, despite walking barefoot across ground that could blister leather. Halfway home, he stopped near a cluster of scrub oak that provided a small patch of shade. Frank dismounted and pulled his canteen from the saddle, taking a long drink before approaching the woman. "Water," he said simply, holding the canteen where she could see it beneath the edge of the sack. She stood motionless for a moment, then nodded slightly. Frank realized she couldn't drink with her hands bound, so he carefully lifted the bottom edge of the sack just enough to expose her mouth. Her lips were cracked and dry, but she drank carefully, not greedy despite what must have been a terrible thirst. When she'd had enough, she pulled back slightly. Frank lowered the sack and stepped away, capping the canteen. They resumed their journey without words. The Broken Wheel Ranch came into view just as the sun reached its zenith. Frank saw it through her eyes, or tried to, anyway, and felt a familiar stab of shame. The place looked like what it was, the dying dream of a man who'd reached too far and grasped nothing but dust. But as they approached the house, Frank noticed something he'd somehow missed in all his worrying about money and failure. The land was beautiful in its harsh way. The desert stretched out in all directions, painted in shades of red and gold and purple that no artist could capture. The mountains rose like sleeping giants against the blue sky, and the silence was so complete it felt like a blessing. Maybe there was something here worth saving after all. Frank dismounted near the front porch, his boots hitting the packed earth. With a dull thud, the woman stood motionless beside Dusty, her head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds he couldn't hear. The ranch felt different with another person present, less empty, but also more fragile, as if her presence highlighted every crack in the foundation, every missing shingle on the roof. He tied Dusty to the hitching post and turned toward his companion. The sack over her head moved gently with her breathing, and Frank realized he'd been thinking of her as the woman because he had no name to attach to her humanity. The people at the auction had called her other things, cruel things he tried to push from his mind, but no one had spoken her actual name. "I'm going to remove this," Frank said, gesturing toward the sack. His voice sounded strange in the quiet desert, rougher than he'd intended. "And the ropes. You're not a prisoner here." She didn't respond, but her posture changed subtly, muscles tensing as if preparing for deception or pain. Frank supposed that made sense. Trust would be a luxury she couldn't afford, especially with a stranger who'd bought her like livestock. Frank moved behind her and began working on the knots that secured her wrists. The leather had been tied tight, and her skin was raw where the bindings had chafed. His fingers worked carefully, trying not to cause additional pain. When the ropes finally fell away, she brought her arms forward slowly, wincing as circulation returned to her hands. Next came the sack. Frank hesitated for a moment, suddenly unsure. What if removing it was somehow a violation? What if she preferred the anonymity it provided? But keeping it on felt worse, like maintaining the degradation of the auction block. He reached up and gently lifted the hemp cloth over her head. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 25, though the hardness in her dark eyes spoke of experiences that had aged her beyond her years. Her black hair hung in long braids that reached past her shoulders, decorated with small beads that caught the sunlight. Her skin was the color of polished copper, and there was a thin scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, old and healed, but still visible. But it was her expression that struck him most. She looked directly into his eyes without flinching, without the submissive downward gaze he'd expected. There was wariness there and calculation, but also a fierce intelligence that made him suddenly conscious of his own appearance, his worn clothes, his unshaven face, the dust that seemed permanently embedded in his skin. "What's your name?" Frank asked. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "Ayanna." Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that spoke of a different language learned first. "Ayanna," Frank repeated, testing the syllables. "I'm Frank, Thomas Franklin Garrett, but most folks just call me Frank." She nodded once, a slight inclination of her head that somehow managed to convey acknowledgement without acceptance. Her eyes moved past him to survey the ranch, the sagging barn, the struggling garden, the windmill that creaked in the constant desert breeze. "This is my home," Frank said, then immediately felt foolish. Of course it was his home. Where else would he have brought her? "I mean, it's where we'll both be staying. There's a room inside you can use." Ayanna's gaze returned to his face. "What do you want from me?" The question was direct, practical, and it caught Frank off guard. He'd been so focused on the auction, on getting her away from Carstairs and men like him, that he hadn't really thought through what came next. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't plan this." Something flickered in her expression, surprise, maybe, or the beginning of curiosity. She'd probably expected lies, promises, threats, or demands. Honesty seemed to be the last thing she'd anticipated. "You paid for me," she said. "Men don't pay money for nothing." Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks. When she put it that way, his actions seemed naive at best, predatory at worst. "I couldn't let Carstairs have you," he said. "I've heard stories about how he treats people. Indian women especially." Ayanna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you're different?" "I hope so," Frank said. "I guess we'll both find out." She studied him for another long moment, then walked past him toward the house. Her movements were graceful despite her ordeal, and Frank noticed she favored her left foot slightly. When she reached the porch steps, she stopped and looked back at him. "I'm hungry," she said simply. Frank nodded and followed her inside. The interior of the house was dim and cool, a relief after the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes, books, and the accumulated debris of solitary living. Ayanna's eyes moved methodically around the space, cataloging everything: the doors, the windows, the knife block on the counter, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Frank realized she was mapping escape routes and potential weapons. The thought should have worried him, but instead it impressed him. She was thinking like a survivor. "There's not much," Frank said, opening a cupboard to reveal a few cans, some dried beans, and a loaf of bread that had seen better days. "Beans and bacon, mostly, some cornmeal. I was planning to go hunting tomorrow." Ayanna approached the shelves and examined their contents with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to make meals from scraps. She selected a can of tomatoes, dried onions, and a small bag of rice. "I can cook," she said, not asking permission but stating fact. Frank nodded and stepped back to give her room to work. He felt awkward in his own kitchen, unsure whether he should help or stay out of her way. Ayanna moved with efficiency born of necessity, her hands sure and quick as she prepared ingredients. While she worked, Frank found himself stealing glances at her profile. The scar on her face was more prominent from the side, and he wondered how she'd gotten it. A childhood accident? Violence? He wanted to ask, but sensed that questions about her past wouldn't be welcome. Instead, he focused on practical matters. "There's a room at the back of the house," he said. "It was my parents' room before they died. It has its own window and a good lock on the door from the inside." Ayanna's hands paused in their work. She looked at him sideways, studying his expression as if trying to determine whether the offer was genuine or a trap. "Why?" she asked. "Because everyone deserves privacy," Frank said. And because you need to feel safe if you're going to stay. Here, what if I don't want to stay? The question hung in the air between them. Frank had been dreading it, knowing it would come but hoping he'd have more time to figure out an answer. Then you don't, he said finally. I won't stop you. But where would you go? Ayana's expression hardened. My people, where are they? North, in the mountains beyond the Verd River. Frank knew the area she meant rough country, beautiful but unforgiving. It was also more than 100 miles away, across desert and, quote, canyon country that challenged even experienced travelers with horses and supplies. That's a long walk, he said gently. Especially alone. I've walked farther. Frank didn't doubt it. There was something in her bearing that spoke of great distances traveled, of hardships endured and survived. But he also knew the reality of the territory they lived in. A lone Indian woman walking north would face dangers from both the landscape and the people she might encounter. Stay for a while, he said. At least until you've recovered your strength. I won't ask you to do anything you don't want to do. Ayana's dark eyes searched his face as if trying to read his soul. Whatever she saw, there must have satisfied some internal test, because she nodded once and returned to preparing their meal that day. Ate in silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The food was simple but flavorful, seasoned with herbs Frank didn't recognize. Ayana ate with careful deliberation, not the desperate hunger he'd expected from someone who'd been held captive. After dinner, Frank showed her to the back room. It was spartanly furnished, a bed, a dresser, a small table beneath the window. The lock was solid brass, installed by his father years earlier during a period when Apache raids had been common in the area. There are clothes in the dresser, Frank said. They belonged to my mother. She was about your size. Ayana nodded her thanks but made no move to examine the garments. She stood in the doorway, looking into the room as if it were a cave that might contain either treasure or danger. The well is behind the house, Frank continued. Water's good and cold. There's soap and towels in the chest by the kitchen door. Where will you sleep? She asked. Front room. There's a cot by the fireplace. She studied his face again, that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. You're not what I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? Cruelty, she said simply. All white men want something from Indian women, usually the same thing. Frank felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger, not at her, but at the men who'd given her reason to think that way. I'm not all white men, he said. No, she agreed. You're not. She stepped into the room and began to close the door, then paused. Frank, she said, using his name for the first time. Thank you. The door closed with a soft click, followed by the sound of the lock engaging. Frank stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the wooden barrier between them. He felt exhausted, emotionally drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. In the front room, he arranged his bedding on the narrow cot and tried to settle in for sleep, but rest wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, the auction, Carstairs' cruel smile, the weight of Ayana's gaze when he'd removed the sack from her head. What had he gotten himself into? He'd acted on impulse, driven by some combination of conscience and defiance that he still didn't fully understand. Now he had another mouth to feed when he could barely manage his own expenses. He had a woman in his house who didn't trust him, who might disappear in the night or decide he was a threat to be eliminated. But beneath the worry was something else, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, maybe. Or simply the relief of not being alone with his failures. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their voices rising and falling in harmonies, older than human memory. Frank listened to their song and wondered if Ayana was listening too, if the sound reminded her of home and family and everything she'd lost. The desert night was clear and cold, stars burning like scattered diamonds against the black sky. Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond his failing ranch, were the mountains where her people lived. Frank wondered if she was planning to leave, if she was already calculating distances and water sources and the best route north. He hoped she'd stay, at least for a while. Not because he needed a servant or companion, but because he sensed that they were both broken in ways that might heal better in company than in solitude. He'd bought her freedom for $1, but freedom meant the right to choose. Whatever she decided, he'd have to respect it. The coyote's song faded into silence, replaced by the steady creak of the windmill and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Frank closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his dreams were filled with dark eyes that saw too much and voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. Morning came with the brutal efficiency of desert sunrise darkness, giving way to blazing light in a matter of minutes. Frank woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sense that seemed impossible given the meager supplies in his kitchen. He dressed quickly and emerged from his room to find Ayanna standing at the stove, tending a skillet. With practiced ease, she'd changed into his mother's clothes, a simple brown dress that fit her well, with a white apron tied around her waist. Her hair was still braided but cleaner now, the beads catching the early morning light that streamed through the windows. "Morning," Frank said, his voice rough with sleep. She looked up from her cooking and nodded. "There are eggs," she said. "I found them in the chicken coop." Frank blinked in confusion. "I don't have chickens." A small smile tugged at the corner of Ayanna's mouth, the first he'd seen from her. "You do now." 3 hens and a rooster, hiding in the brush behind the barn. They've been wild for a while, but they remembered where home was. Frank walked to the window and peered out toward the barn. Sure enough, he could see brown and red shapes scratching in the dirt, pecking at seeds and insects. His father had kept chickens years ago, before the drought killed most of them and drove the survivors away. He'd assumed they were all dead. "How did you catch them?" he asked. "Patience," Ayanna said. "And corn from your storage bin." She served breakfast on chipped ceramic plates, and Frank was amazed by the transformation she'd wrought with basic ingredients. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp but not burned, and there was even fresh bread warming in the oven. "You didn't have to do this," Frank said as they sat down to eat. "I was hungry," she replied simply. "It's easier to cook for 2 than for 1. They ate in comfortable silence, the tension of the previous day seeming to have eased overnight. Frank found himself watching Ayanna's hands as she broke her bread and stirred her coffee. They were graceful hands with long fingers and calluses that spoke of hard work. There was a thin silver ring on her right hand, set with a small turquoise stone. "That's beautiful," Frank said, nodding toward the ring. Ayanna's fingers closed protectively around the jewelry. "It was my mother's," she said. "Was? She died when I was 15. Soldiers came to our village in winter. There was sickness afterward." Frank felt the weight of old grief in her words. "I'm sorry," he said. Ayanna shrugged, but Frank could see the pain she was hiding. "Many died that winter. My father, my 2 brothers. I survived because I was visiting my aunt's family in another place." "Is that where you're trying to get back to?" "Your aunt?" "No. She died last spring. But there are others, cousins, friends. From childhood. People who remember my name." Frank understood the longing in her voice. He'd felt something similar after his parents died. That desire to connect with people who'd known him before loss changed everything. But his connections were all here, in this place that seemed determined to defeat him. "What about you?" Ayanna asked. "Do you have a family?" "Not anymore. My parents are buried on the hill behind the house. Had a sister once, but she married a man from California. Haven't heard from her in 3 years. So we're both alone," Ayanna observed. "I guess we are." After breakfast, Frank showed Ayanna around the ranch. She listened attentively as he explained the various buildings and their functions. asking practical questions about water sources, soil quality, and the challenges of desert farming. At the garden, she knelt and sifted the dry earth through her fingers. "This ground is tired," she said. "It needs rest and feeding." "I've tried everything," Frank said. "Fertilizer, different crops, more water. Nothing seems to work." Ayanna stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "You're fighting the land instead of working with it. This earth doesn't want corn and wheat. It wants plants that belong here." "What kind of plants?" She walked to the edge of the garden where wild vegetation grew in scattered clumps. "These," she said, pointing to various specimens. "Desert willow for medicine, prickly pear for food, mesquite beans, sage, plants that grow without much water, that feed the soil instead of depleting it." Frank had never thought of the wild plants as anything but weeds to be cleared away. "You know about farming?" "My people have lived in this country for generations," Ayanna said. "We learned to work with the land instead of against it." For the first time since inheriting the ranch, Frank felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was another way to make this place productive, a method that didn't require fighting the desert's fundamental nature. They spent the morning exploring the property together, Ayanna pointing out edible plants and water signs that Frank had never noticed. She moved through the landscape like someone reading a familiar book, understanding connections and relationships that were invisible to his eyes. At the small creek that formed the ranch's eastern boundary, she knelt and cupped water in her hands, tasting it carefully. "Good water," she said. "Sweet and clean. You could build ponds here, catch the spring runoff for dry times." "I never thought of that," Frank admitted. "White men always think big," Ayanna said, not unkindly. "Big farms, big herds, big profits. But the desert teaches patience. Small steps, careful planning, working with what exists instead of trying to create what doesn't belong." They returned to the house for lunch, and Frank found himself looking at his property with new eyes. Instead of seeing failure and inadequacy, he began to glimpse possibilities he'd never considered. Maybe salvation didn't have to come from outside. Investment or miraculous changes in weather patterns. Maybe it was already here, waiting for him to learn how to see it. That afternoon, Ayanna began working in the garden, not planting new crops, but tending to the wild plants that grew at its margins. Frank watched from the porch, fascinated by her knowledge of which stems to cut, which leaves to harvest, which roots to carefully expose. "She knows this land better than you do," he muttered to himself, "and she's only been here one day." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Frank realized something had shifted in his understanding of the situation. Yesterday, he'd been a failing rancher facing bankruptcy and shame. Today, he was a man with a partner who possessed knowledge he desperately needed. But partnership required trust, and trust had to be earned. Frank looked toward the garden where Ayanna worked in the slanting afternoon light, her movements economical and purposeful. She'd chosen to stay, at least for now. Whether that choice would last depended on what they built together in the days to come. The third week brought unexpected visitors and unwelcome news. Frank was mending fence near the northern boundary when he spotted a dust cloud approaching. From the direction of town, 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, and his stomach dropped when he recognized the lead horse. A black stallion that belonged to Marcus Thornfield. The bank president rode with 2 companions Frank didn't know, both wearing the kind of suits that marked them as Eastern businessmen. Their faces were pale beneath their hat brims, unaccustomed to the brutal Arizona sun. Thornfield himself looked grim, his usual practiced smile nowhere in evidence. Frank set down his tools and walked toward the house, arriving just as the riders dismounted near the front porch. Ayanna emerged from the kitchen garden where she'd been harvesting wild greens, her eyes immediately alert to potential danger. "Frank," Thornfield called out, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man delivering bad news. "We need to talk," About what? Frank asked, though he suspected he already knew. Your loan payments. You're 4 months behind now, and I've got some people here who have questions about the property. The two strangers stepped forward, and Frank noticed they moved with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. The taller one, a thin man with steel-gray hair, extended his hand. Richard Pemberton, he said. I represent a consortium of investors from Denver. This is my associate, James Crawford. Crawford was younger and stockier, with calculating eyes that were already appraising the ranch buildings and surrounding land. We've heard this property might be available for purchase, he said without preamble. Frank felt heat rise in his chest. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, Pemberton replied smoothly. Mr. Thornfield has explained your financial situation. We're prepared to make a generous offer enough to pay off your debts and leave you with a substantial sum to start fresh elsewhere. I said it's not for sale, Frank repeated, his voice harder now. Crawford pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and extracted several documents. We've done our research, Mr. Garrett. This land sits directly in the path of the proposed Southern Railroad extension. When that line comes through, and it will, this property will be worth 10 times what it is today. Frank's mind reeled. A railroad extension. He'd heard rumors, but nothing concrete. If it was true, it would explain the investor's sudden interest in his failing ranch. Even if that's true, Frank said carefully, it doesn't change anything. This is my home. Pemberton's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Garrett, let me be direct. You owe the bank $800. Your ranch produces maybe $50 worth of income per year, if you're lucky. The mathematics of your situation are quite simple. Thornfield shifted uncomfortably. Frank, these gentlemen are offering $1,200 for the property. That's more than fair market value, even considering the railroad prospects. It's a generous offer, Crawford added. But it won't remain on the table indefinitely. Railroad companies don't wait for stubborn ranchers to see reason. Frank glanced toward Ayanna, who had moved closer during the conversation. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see tension in the way she held herself. This discussion wasn't just about his future, it was about hers as well. I need time to think, Frank said. How much time? Pemberton asked. 2 weeks. Crawford laughed, a sound without humor. 2 weeks? Mr. Garrett, this railroad project moves on its own schedule, not yours. We need an answer by the end of this week. That's not enough time to fee. It's plenty of time to pack your belongings, Crawford interrupted. Unless you prefer to wait for the bank to foreclose. I understand that process can be quite unpleasant. Thornfield looked genuinely apologetic. Frank, I've tried to be patient, but I have responsibilities to my depositors. If you can't make good on your debts. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Frank felt the walls closing in around him, the future narrowing to a single, inevitable conclusion. Everything his family had worked to build would be lost, scattered to the wind like tumbleweeds. 5 days, Pemberton said, mounting his horse. We'll return Friday morning for your answer. I suggest you use the time wisely. The 3 men rode away, leaving Frank and Ayanna standing in the dusty yard. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. You're going to sell, Ayanna said finally. It wasn't a question. I don't have a choice, Frank replied, his voice hollow. $800 might as well be $8,000. I can't raise that kind of money. Ayanna walked to the edge of the porch and sat on the steps, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. So we both lose our homes, she said quietly. The "we" in her statement struck Frank like a physical blow. Somewhere over the past weeks, without his conscious awareness, he'd begun thinking of the ranch as belonging to both of them. Her knowledge had transformed his understanding of the land. Her presence had given purpose to his daily routines. The thought of losing all that felt worse than mere financial failure. You could go north, Frank said. To your people in the mountains. You don't have to stay here and watch this place die. And you could take their money and start over somewhere else, Ayanna replied. But neither of us wants to run away. Frank sat beside her on the steps, close enough to catch the scent of sage and sunlight that seemed to cling to her hair. What choice do we have? There's always a choice, she said. Sometimes the choices are all bad, but they still exist. They sat in silence as shadows lengthened across the yard. Frank's mind churned through possibilities, each one leading to the same dead end. He could sell to the investors and salvage something from the wreckage, or he could wait for foreclosure and lose everything. There didn't seem to be a third option. That evening, they shared a quiet dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread. Ayanna had become an expert at stretching their meager supplies, creating meals that satisfied both hunger and the soul. Frank found himself studying her face in the lamplight, memorizing details he might never see again. "Tell me about your people," he said suddenly. "The ones in the mountains." Ayanna set down her spoon and considered the question. "My father's cousin leads them, now a man named Nasota. He's wise but careful. The government leaves them alone because they stay hidden, cause no trouble. Would they accept you back?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But they would ask questions about where I've been, what I've learned. They would want to know about you. What would you tell them?" Ayanna's dark eyes met his across the small table. "That I found a white man who doesn't take what isn't freely given. That he treated me like a person instead of property. They would find that ... interesting." Frank felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. In the weeks since the auction, he'd questioned his motivations dozens of times, wondering if he'd acted out of genuine compassion or some deeper, more selfish need. Her simple statement felt like absolution. "Maybe you should go to them," Frank said, "before Friday. Before everything falls apart here." "Maybe," Ayanna agreed. "Or maybe there's another way." "What other way?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "My people have stories about times when the world changed too fast, when old ways of living no longer worked. The survivors were those who learned to adapt, who found new ways to use old wisdom." Frank didn't understand where she was leading, but he sensed something important in her words. "What kind of new ways?" "The railroad men want your land because trains will bring people, travelers, settlers, businessmen. But what will those people need when they arrive in this desert? Food, water, shelter. Medicine when they fall sick, guides who know the country." Frank began to see the shape of her thinking. "You're talking about a business." "I'm talking about survival," Ayanna corrected. "But sometimes they're the same thing." She rose from the table and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. "This land you think is worthless. It grows medicine plants that doctors in the cities would pay good money for. The creek could support fish ponds, vegetable gardens that would feed travelers. The barn could be rebuilt as a way station for people traveling the railroad." Frank felt a spark of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. "You really think it could work?" "I think it's better than running away," Ayanna said. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, their voices growing more animated as ideas took shape. Frank found himself looking at his property through Ayanna's eyes, seeing opportunities where he'd only seen obstacles. Her knowledge of desert plants and water management, combined with his understanding of business and the needs of travelers, might indeed create something sustainable. But hope was a luxury they couldn't afford without capital, and capital was exactly what they lacked. "Even if we could make it work," Frank said finally, "we'd need money to get started. Money I don't have." "How much money?" Frank did quick calculations in his head. "To pay off the bank and have enough left to rebuild? At least $1,000. Maybe more." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "There might be a way. What way? She returned to the table and sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Before the soldiers came to our village, before my family died, my father was a trading chief. He dealt with Mexican merchants, army suppliers, other tribes. He was successful. Frank waited, sensing there was more to the story. When the attacks began, when people started dying, my father hid his most valuable possessions. Gold coins, silver jewelry, trade goods that couldn't be replaced. He told me where, in case something happened to him. Frank's pulse quickened. Are you saying there's treasure hidden somewhere? Not treasure, Ayanna corrected. Survival. My father's insurance against disaster. Where is it? 3 days' ride north, in a canyon near the Verde River. Hidden in a place only I know. Frank stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. How much? Enough, she said simply. More than enough to save this ranch and start the kind of business we talked about. Questions tumbled through Frank's mind. Why hadn't she mentioned this before? Was it real, or just desperate wishful thinking? And if it was real, why would she risk everything to help him save a ranch that wasn't even hers? Why? He asked finally. Why would you do this for me? Ayanna's expression softened slightly. Maybe because you're the first person in years who's asked what I wanted instead of simply taking what you needed. Maybe because this place feels more like home than anywhere I've been since my family died. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Or maybe because I'm tired of running from white men's greed. Maybe it's time to turn and fight. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, settling into place of pieces he hadn't realized were scattered. This woman who had every reason to hate and distrust him was offering to risk her most precious inheritance to save his failing dream. It's dangerous, he said. That's Apache country between here and the Verde River, and if Carstairs or his friends find out what we're doing, everything worthwhile is dangerous, Ayanna replied. The question is whether you're willing to try. Frank looked around the kitchen, at the rough wooden table where they'd shared so many meals, at the shelves Ayanna had organized with quiet efficiency, at the window that looked out over land his father had died trying to tame. This place had been killing him slowly, grinding him down with its endless demands and meager rewards. But somewhere in the past weeks, it had also become something else, a home worth fighting for. When do we leave? He asked. Ayanna smiled not. The small, careful expressions he'd grown accustomed to, but a real smile that transformed her entire face. Tomorrow at dawn. We'll need supplies for a week, and we'll have to travel light and fast. What about the investors? They'll be back Friday. Then we'd better be back by Thursday night, she said. Frank nodded, his mind already racing ahead to preparations and logistics. He felt more alive than he had in months, energized by the prospect of action after weeks of passive acceptance. Whether they succeeded or failed, at least they would be choosing their own fate instead of letting others choose for them. Ayanna, he said as she prepared to retire for the night. Thank you for everything. She paused in the doorway, looking back at him. Don't thank me yet, Frank. We haven't gotten there and back alive. And even if we do, there's no guarantee we can build something that works. But we'll try. Yes, she agreed. We'll try. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with stars still visible on the western horizon. Frank woke before sunrise to find Ayanna already moving quietly through the house, packing supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd made many hurried departures. She'd chosen practical items, jerky, hardtack, coffee, blankets, ammunition for Frank's rifle. Her own possessions fit in a small leather pouch, the turquoise ring, a bone-handled knife, a few personal items whose significance Frank could only guess at. Ready? She asked as Frank finished saddling Dusty and a second horse he'd borrowed from a neighbor. Frank took a last look around the ranch, fixing its details in his memory. The sagging barn roof, the struggling garden, the mountains rising like ancient guardians in the distance. In 4 days, he would either return as the ranch's savior or ride away from it forever. "Ready," he said. They rode north as the sun climbed. Above the eastern peaks, two unlikely partners bound together by desperation, hope, and something deeper that neither had yet found words to express. Behind them, the Broken Wheel Ranch dozed in the morning heat, waiting to learn its fate. The trail wound through increasingly rugged country, climbing into foothills covered with juniper and oak. Ayanna rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs of danger or direction. Frank found himself watching her more than the landscape, fascinated by her unconscious competence in this harsh environment. By midday, they had climbed high enough to see vast distances in every direction. The desert spread below them like a rumpled brown carpet, broken by the green lines of streams and the dark shadows of mesas. Somewhere out there, beyond the heat shimmer and the endless sage, lay whatever remained of Ayanna's father's legacy. And somewhere behind them, a failing ranch waited for its owners to return with either salvation or the courage to let it die with dignity. The second day of their journey brought them into a country that seemed untouched by civilization. Ancient volcanic peaks thrust up from canyon floors like the vertebrae of sleeping giants. The air thinned as they climbed, carrying scents of pine and snow from distant summits. Frank had never traveled this far north, and the landscape felt both magnificent and menacing. Ayanna moved through the terrain with the confidence of inherited knowledge, reading signs in bent grass and scattered stones that told stories Frank couldn't begin to decipher. She chose their path carefully, avoiding obvious trails and keeping to rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints. When Frank asked about her caution, she simply pointed to smoke rising from a distant ridge. "Apache hunting party," she said, "or soldiers. Either way, we don't want to meet them." They made a cold camp that night in a hidden grove of cottonwoods beside a spring that bubbled up from underground. Frank would have preferred a fire, but Ayanna shook her head when he started gathering wood. "Light travels far in this country," she explained, "and there are people out there who would kill us for our horses alone." As they shared jerky and hardtack in the gathering darkness, Frank found himself studying Ayanna's profile in the starlight. The journey had awakened something in her, a sureness of movement and purpose that hadn't been present at the ranch. Here, in this wild country, she seemed more herself than she ever had in his kitchen. "You miss this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she admitted, "but not the danger. Not the constant fear of who might be watching from the next ridge." "Then, why did you agree to help me? You could have taken what you needed from your father's cache and disappeared into these mountains. Your people would have protected you." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Frank thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because running away doesn't heal anything. It just moves the pain to a different place." Frank understood. He'd spent the last year running from his father's debts, his own failures, the growing certainty that he wasn't man enough to make the ranch work. The auction, meeting Ayanna, even this desperate journey, they were all ways of finally turning to face what he'd been fleeing. "My father used to say that a man's character wasn't revealed by his successes," Frank said. "It was revealed by what he did when everything went wrong." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was a dreamer," Frank corrected. "But maybe sometimes dreamers see things more clearly than practical people." Ayanna shifted closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder against his. "What do you dream about, Frank?" The question caught him off guard. When had anyone last asked him about his dreams rather than his problems? "I used to dream about making the ranch profitable, about proving my father's vision wasn't just foolishness." He paused, considering. "Lately, I dream about something different." "What?" "A place where people can stop running. Where someone like you doesn't have to choose between hiding in the mountains or being sold at auction." where someone like me doesn't have to apologize for trying to build something beautiful, even if it doesn't make money. Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks. His words sounded naive in the darkness, the fantasies of a man who'd never learned to accept reality. But Ayanna didn't laugh or offer the gentle corrections he expected. "That's a good dream," she said simply. They slept under the stars, taking turns keeping watch. During Frank's shift, he found himself memorizing the way moonlight played across Ayanna's sleeping face, the rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hand rested protectively over the leather pouch that contained her few possessions. Somewhere, in the weeks since the auction, she had become precious to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The third day brought them to a country that defied description. Red sandstone cliffs rose like cathedral walls on either side of narrow canyons. Water had carved impossible sculptures from the living rock, arches and spires and formations that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The horses' hooves echoed strangely in the confined spaces, creating phantom sounds that made Frank constantly look over his shoulder. "We're close," Ayanna said as they paused to rest the horses beside a natural pool. "The cache is hidden in a canyon just ahead, in a place my people call the Room of Echoes." Frank could hear nervousness in her voice for the first time since they'd begun the journey. "Are you worried it won't be there?" "I'm worried about what we'll find besides the cache," she said. "My father chose that hiding place because it was sacred ground, protected by taboos that would keep others away. But desperate people don't always respect taboos." They pressed on as the afternoon shadows lengthened, following a trail that was more suggestion than reality. The canyon walls closed in around them until they were riding single file through a passage barely wide enough for the horses. Frank began to feel claustrophobic, oppressed by the weight of stone overhead. Then the passage opened into a circular chamber, perhaps 50 yards across. The walls rose in smooth curves to a perfect circle of sky far above. Natural acoustics amplified every sound: the horses breathing, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind through unseen openings. Frank understood immediately why Ayanna's people called it the Room of Echoes. "There," Ayanna said, pointing to a pile of stones at the base of the far wall. "Under those rocks." They dismounted and approached the cairn. The stones had been carefully placed to look natural, but Frank could see the subtle signs of human arrangement. Ayanna knelt beside the pile and began removing rocks with reverent care. "Help me," she said, and Frank joined her in the work. Beneath the stones they found a leather-wrapped bundle, the size of a saddlebag. Ayanna's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it from its hiding place. The leather was cracked with age but still intact, bound with sinew that had somehow survived the desert climate. "Should we open it here?" Frank asked Dot before Ayanna could answer. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the chamber. Stone chips exploded from the wall, inches from Frank's head. Both he and Ayanna dove for cover behind the nearest boulder as more shots followed. "Well, well," a familiar voice called from somewhere above. "Look what we found." Frank's blood turned to ice. Edmund Carstairs stood on a ledge 20 feet above them, flanked by 2 rough-looking men with rifles trained on their position. Young man's pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Did you really think you could just ride off into the desert without anyone noticing?" Carstairs continued. "Especially with something that belongs to me?" "She doesn't belong to you," Frank called back, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. Carstairs laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, but she does. I had the winning bid at that auction until you interfered with your pathetic grandstanding. I've been waiting for the right moment to collect what's mine." Ayanna pressed closer to Frank behind their shelter. He could feel her trembling with rage rather than fear. "How did they find us?" she whispered. "Been following you since yesterday," Carstairs answered, apparently having heard her question. "Not too hard to track 2 people who don't know how to hide their trail properly." Frank realized with sick certainty that Carstairs was right. He'd been so focused on the destination that he'd paid little attention to covering their tracks. His inexperience had led them into a trap. "What do you want?" Frank called out. "What do you think I want?" The woman, obviously. "But I'm curious about what you found under those rocks. Must be something valuable to bring you all this way." One of Carstairs' men shifted position, trying to get a better angle on their hiding place. Frank had his rifle, but 3 against 2 were bad odds, especially when the enemy held the high ground. "Let her go," Frank said. "Take whatever's in the bundle, but let her walk away." "Now why would I do that?" Carstairs replied. "I've got very specific plans for our Apache princess. Been thinking about them for weeks." Ayanna's jaw tightened at the crude implications in his voice. She pulled her bone-handled knife from its sheath, testing the edge with her thumb. "I won't be taken again," she said quietly. Frank understood. Whatever happened here, she would fight to the death rather than submit to Carstairs' cruelty. The knowledge filled him with a mixture of admiration and terror. "There's no way out of this canyon except past us," Carstairs called down. "You can make this easy or hard, but the ending's the same either way." Frank's mind raced through possibilities. The chamber walls were too smooth to climb, and there was no cover between their position and the narrow entrance. They were trapped, as effectively as animals in a pen. Then Ayanna touched his arm and pointed to a dark opening in the wall behind them, a crack he'd taken for a shadow but now realized was a passage. "Cave," she whispered. "Might lead deeper into the canyon system." It was a desperate chance, but better than facing 3 rifles in the open. Frank nodded and gathered the leather bundle while Ayanna prepared to move. "On 3, he mouthed. They broke from cover together, sprinting toward the dark opening as rifles cracked behind them. Frank felt the wind of a bullet pass his ear before they plunged into the blessed darkness of the cave. The passage was narrow and winding, forcing them to feel their way forward by touch. Behind them, they could hear Carstairs cursing and shouting orders to his men. Boots scraped on stone as their pursuers began climbing down into the chamber. "This way," Ayanna whispered, leading Frank deeper into the earth. The cave system proved to be extensive, branching and subdividing like the roots of some vast stone tree. Ayanna chose their path with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural, always selecting passages that led upward and away from their starting point. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they saw light ahead, not the harsh glare of desert sun, but the softer glow of evening sky. The passage opened onto a ledge halfway up the canyon's outer wall, hidden from view by an overhang of stone. Frank collapsed against the rock wall, his heart hammering in his chest. The leather bundle was still clutched in his arms, somehow preserved. Through their frantic flight, Ayanna moved to the edge of the ledge and peered down at the canyon floor far below. "I can see the horses," she said. "Carstairs left one of his men to guard them." "What about the other 2? "Still searching the caves, probably. But they'll figure out we escaped eventually." Frank knew she was right. Their head start wouldn't last long, and they still had to get to the horses and escape the canyon before Carstairs organized a proper pursuit. "Can we get down there?" he asked. Ayanna studied the cliff face below them. "Yes, but it's dangerous. And we'll be exposed for several minutes while we climb. What choice do we have?" She was quiet for a moment, then turned to face him. "Frank, there's something I need to tell you. About the cache, about why my father hid it here. Can it wait until we're safe?" "No," she said firmly. "Because if something happens to me, you need to know the truth." Frank felt cold dread settle in his stomach. "What truth?" Ayanna opened the leather bundle with careful hands. Inside, Frank saw what he'd expected: gold coins, silver jewelry, and other valuable items that caught the fading light. But beneath these obvious treasures lay something else: a stack of papers covered with official-looking seals and signatures. These are land grants, Ayanna said, lifting the documents. Deeds to thousands of acres of territory, signed by Mexican authorities. Before the American conquest. My father wasn't just a trading chief, he was a land speculator, buying grants from corrupt officials who needed quick money. Frank stared at the papers, their implications slowly dawning on him. Are you saying? I'm saying that according to these documents, my father owned most of the Verde River Valley, including the land where the railroad wants to build their extension. Land that's now claimed by American settlers and corporations who have no legal right to it. Frank's head spun. The cash wasn't just enough money to save his ranch. It was potentially worth millions if the land grants could be validated in American courts. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I wasn't sure the papers had survived. And because knowledge like this gets people killed. Ayanna's voice was grim. If Carstairs or men like him knew what we were carrying, they wouldn't just want to capture me, they'd want to eliminate anyone who'd seen these documents. A rifle shot echoed from somewhere below, followed by angry shouts. Their pursuers had discovered the cave entrance. We have to go, Frank said, rewrapping the bundle. Frank. Ayanna caught his arm as he prepared to begin the climb down. If something happens to me, promise you'll get these documents to my cousin Nashoda. He'll know what to do with them. Nothing's going to happen to you, Frank said. Promise me. Frank looked into her dark eyes and saw a determination that matched his own. I promise. But I'm also promising that we're both going to survive this. Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her face despite their desperate circumstances. Then we'd better start climbing. They began their descent as the last light faded from the western sky. The rock was treacherous, crumbling under their hands and feet, but they moved with the desperate efficiency of people who had no choice but to succeed. Halfway down, a shout from above told them they'd been spotted. A rifle cracked, and stone fragments showered around them. Frank pressed himself against the cliff face, feeling horribly exposed and vulnerable. Keep moving, Ayanna called from below him, almost there. They dropped the last 10 feet to the canyon floor, landing hard but intact. The guard Carstairs had left with the horses was nowhere to be seen, probably drawn away by the commotion. In the caves, Frank and Ayanna ran for their mounts, throwing themselves into the saddles as more shots echoed from the canyon walls. They spurred their horses toward the narrow entrance, the sound of hoofbeats clattering off stone like thunder. Behind them, Frank could hear Carstairs screaming orders, but the words were lost in the acoustic confusion of the chamber. They burst from the canyon into the open desert just as full darkness fell, the bundle of documents and gold secure in Frank's saddlebags. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and dry washes that Ayanna navigated by starlight and instinct. Frank had never felt so alive, every sense heightened by danger and the presence of the woman riding beside him. Whatever happened next, they had faced the worst together and emerged intact. As dawn broke over the distant peaks, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, Frank realized that everything had changed. They weren't just carrying treasure back to save his ranch, they were carrying the power to reshape the entire territory. The question was whether they could survive long enough to use it. How far to home? He asked as they paused to rest the horses beside a hidden spring. Ayanna looked back toward the mountains they'd fled, then ahead toward the familiar landmarks of their journey south. 8 hours if we push hard, but Frank... What? Carstairs won't give up. He'll follow us back to the ranch, and he'll bring help. This isn't over. Frank nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They had won the treasure, but in doing so they had declared war on men who would stop at nothing to claim what they wanted. Then we'd better be ready for them, he said. The sun had climbed to its merciless zenith when Frank and Ayanna finally crested the ridge overlooking the Broken Wheel Ranch. Below them, the familiar collection of weathered buildings shimmered in the heat like a mirage that might dissolve at any moment. Frank's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name, relief at returning home, mixed with dread at what was surely coming. The horses were exhausted, their flanks white with dried sweat and their heads hanging low. Dusty's breathing came in labored gasps, and Frank knew they had pushed the animals to their absolute limits. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of canyons and desert flats, Edmund Carstairs and his hired guns were following their trail with the persistence of bloodhounds. "We need to prepare for a siege," Ayanna said as they began their descent toward the ranch. Her voice was steady, but Frank could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, the way she swayed slightly in the saddle. "How long do you think?" "We have? Not long. Maybe 4 hours if we're lucky. Carstairs has fresh horses and men who know this country. He'll push hard to catch us before we can dig in." Frank's mind was already racing ahead to defensive preparations. The ranch house was built like a fort, thick adobe walls, small windows, and only 2 entrances. His father had designed it that way during the Apache troubles of the 1860s, never imagining that his son might one day need those same defensive features against white men. They reached the yard as the windmill's blades caught a gust of wind. The familiar creaking sound, somehow reassuring after the alien acoustics of the canyon country. Frank dismounted and immediately began unsaddling the horses, his movements swift and efficient despite his exhaustion. "Get the animals into the barn," he told Ayanna. "We need to make sure they're safe and out of the line of fire." While Ayanna led the horses to shelter, Frank ran to the house and began gathering weapons and ammunition. His father's old Springfield rifle hung above the mantelpiece, and there was a shotgun in the bedroom closet. A wooden box beneath his bed held maybe 50 rounds of ammunition, not much for a sustained fight, but it would have to do. Ayanna returned from the barn carrying an armload of tools, a pick, a shovel, and a heavy iron bar. "We need to fortify the approaches," she said. "Dig rifle pits. Create obstacles that will force them to attack where we want them to." Frank nodded, impressed by her tactical thinking. "You've done this before." "My people fought a war for survival for 3 generations," she replied grimly. "You learn things." They worked through the afternoon with desperate energy, transforming the peaceful ranch into a fortress. Frank dug a shallow trench behind the woodpile that commanded a view of the main approach, while Ayanna created a second position near the well that covered the barn and the eastern approach to the house. From his father's workshop, Frank retrieved every piece of scrap metal he could find: old horseshoes, broken tools, lengths of chain. These they scattered in the yard to create obstacles for mounted attackers. Ayanna gathered thorny branches from the desert and wove them into barriers that would channel any assault into the killing zones they had prepared. As they worked, they talked through their plan. The house would be their final redoubt, but they would try to hold the outer positions as long as possible. If overwhelmed, they would fall back to the thick walled adobe structure and make their last stand there. "What about the legal documents?" Frank asked as he carried water to their fighting positions. "Should we hide them somewhere safe?" Ayanna paused in her work, considering. "No, if we die here, they die with us. But if we survive... She looked out across the desert toward the distant mountains where her people lived. "If we survive, those papers will change everything." Frank understood. The land grants weren't just valuable, they were revolutionary. In the right hands, they could challenge the entire structure of territorial land ownership, potentially returning thousands of acres to their rightful native owners. Men would kill to possess such documents, and other men would die to keep them secret. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when they heard the first sound of pursuit, a distant dust cloud rising beyond the eastern ridge. Frank felt his stomach clench as he counted the riders. 8 men, maybe 9, riding hard toward the ranch. "More than I expected," Ayanna said, lowering the spyglass they had used to watch the approaches. "Carstairs must have sent for help." Frank checked his rifle. For the dozenth time, ensuring the action was smooth and the sights were clear. Probably offered his friends a share of whatever treasure he thinks we found. They took their positions as the riders drew closer. Frank crouched in his trench behind the woodpile, the Springfield's familiar weight solid in his hands. Ayanna settled into her position near the well, her father's old carbine trained on the barn approach. The attack came just as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Carstairs led his men in a thundering charge across the open ground, their weapons flashing in the dying light. Frank waited until they were within 100 yards before opening fire. His first shot took down the lead horse, sending its rider tumbling into the dust. The Springfield's boom echoed across the desert as Frank worked the bolt, chambering another round. To his right, Ayanna's carbine cracked in rapid succession, forcing two riders to seek cover behind the barn, but there were too many of them. While Frank and Ayanna engaged the frontal assault, 3 men circled wide to attack from the north. Frank saw them too late, just as they opened fire from behind the chicken coop. "Fall back," he shouted, abandoning his position as bullets chewed splinters from the wood pile around him. The retreat to the house was a running battle, across 20 yards of open ground. Frank felt the wind of bullets passing close enough to part his hair, heard the distinctive whine of ricochets off the adobe walls. Ayanna reached the back door first, providing covering fire as Frank dove through the entrance. Inside, the house felt like a tomb-thick walls muffling the sounds of battle, small windows allowing only glimpses of their attackers. Frank barricaded the back door with a heavy table while Ayanna took position at the front window. "Kitchen window," she called out, and Frank saw a man's shadow moving past the glass. He fired through the window, shattering the panes and sending their attacker scrambling for cover. Outside, Carstairs was shouting orders, organizing his men for a coordinated assault on the house. "They're going to try to burn us out," Ayanna said, reading the tactical situation. "Adobe won't burn, but the roof is wood and thatch." Frank's blood chilled as he realized she was right. The roof was the house's weakest point, and fire arrows or torches could turn their fortress into a death trap. They needed to break the siege before Carstairs thought of that solution. "There," Ayanna pointed to movement near the barn. "Carstairs is behind the water trough, directing the others." Frank studied the distance and angles. It was a difficult shot, maybe 60 yards through a narrow gap between buildings. But if he could take out Carstairs, the others might lose heart and withdraw. He steadied the rifle against the window frame, controlling his breathing as his father had taught him years ago. The front sight settled on Carstairs's pale face, visible above the wooden trough. Frank began to squeeze the trigger. The shot was interrupted by a tremendous crash as the front door exploded inward. 2 men rushed through the opening, revolvers blazing. Frank spun away from the window as bullets splintered the frame where his head had been. Ayanna met the attackers with her carbine, working the lever action with deadly precision. The first man dropped immediately, clutching his chest. The second got off one wild shot before Ayanna's next bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the stone fireplace. But the breach in their defenses had been made. More men were charging toward the shattered door, and Frank could hear others trying to force entry through the back of the house. The final phase of the battle had begun. "Upstairs!" Frank shouted, grabbing the leather bundle that contained their precious documents. They retreated up the narrow staircase to the house's second floor, a low-ceilinged space that his father had used for storage. There was only one small window facing east, but it provided a commanding view of the approaches to the house. Below them, Frank could hear boots on the wooden floors, furniture being overturned, the harsh voices of men searching for their quarry. Carstairs was among them, his refined accent cutting through the rougher speech of his hired killers. "Find them," he was shouting. "They can't have vanished into thin air." Frank and Ayanna crouched beneath the single window, hardly daring to breathe. The floorboards beneath them were old and might creak at any movement. Discovery seemed inevitable. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to check the upper floor. Then Ayanna touched Frank's arm and pointed toward the window. Outside, the desert evening was settling into full darkness, stars beginning to appear in the clear sky. But more importantly, Frank could see new lights moving across. The landscape torches or lanterns carried by riders approaching from the south. More of Carstairs' men? Frank whispered. Ayanna shook her head, her expression suddenly hopeful. Look at how they ride. That's not how white men sit on horses. Frank studied the approaching lights more carefully. She was right, there was something different about the silhouettes, the way the riders moved as one with their mounts. These were horsemen trained from childhood, people for whom riding was as natural as walking. Your people, Frank breathed. Nashota, Ayanna confirmed. My cousin. He must have seen the smoke from our guns, or perhaps the spirits told him I was in danger. Below them, someone had noticed the approaching riders as well. Carstairs' voice rose in alarm as he ordered his men to defensive positions. The hunt for Frank and Ayanna was temporarily forgotten as a new threat materialized from the darkness. The battle that followed was unlike anything Frank had ever witnessed. Nashota's warriors struck like ghosts, appearing from the desert silence, to loose arrows and vanish again before Carstairs' men could return fire. Their war cries echoed off the adobe walls, sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself, ancient and terrible. Caught between the house and the attacking Apaches, Carstairs' hired guns began to panic. These were men accustomed to easy violence against defenseless victims, not warriors who had spent their lives perfecting the art of desert warfare. One by one, they broke and ran for their horses. Carstairs himself held his position behind the water trough, his pale eyes wild with rage and desperation. Frank could see him through the window, still clutching his rifle, still shouting orders that no one was obeying. He won't give up, Ayanna said quietly. Men like that never do. He'll die before he admits defeat, Frank understood. Carstairs had staked everything on this assault, his reputation, his standing with other territorial power brokers, his own conception of himself as a man who took what he wanted. Retreat would mean acknowledging that he could be beaten by people he considered inferior. The sounds of battle were moving away from the house now as Nashota's warriors pursued the fleeing attackers into the desert. But Carstairs remained, a solitary figure in the moonlit yard, his rifle trained on the house where he knew his quarry was hidden. I'm going down there, Frank said. That's suicide, Ayanna protested. He's got good cover and a clear field of fire. Maybe, but this won't end until one of us is dead. And I won't have him threatening you and your people because of something I started. Frank moved toward the stairs, but Ayanna caught his arm. Then we go together, she said. This is my fight too. They descended the staircase carefully, avoiding the creaking steps they had identified during their retreat. The main floor of the house was a wreck, furniture overturned, windows shattered, blood staining the wooden floors. But it was empty of enemies out at the front door. Frank paused to study the tactical situation. Carstairs was maybe 30 yards away, concealed behind the water trough with excellent cover and clear sight lines to both the front and back doors. Any attempt to rush him would be suicidal. There's another way, Ayanna whispered, pointing toward the kitchen. The root cellar has an exit that comes up behind the chicken coop. We could flank him. Frank nodded, impressed once again by her tactical thinking. They made their way through the debris-strewn kitchen to a wooden trapdoor that led to the underground storage space his father had carved from the desert hardpan. The root cellar was cramped and airless, smelling of potatoes and onions and the accumulated dust of years. But it served its purpose, allowing them to move unseen beneath the yard to emerge behind Carstairs' position, The exit was concealed behind a pile of old lumber near the chicken coop. Frank pushed aside the boards carefully, creating just enough space for them to squeeze through. Above ground, he could hear Carstairs muttering to himself, the words of a man whose grip on sanity was slipping. Come out, wherever you are," the young man was chanting. "I know you're in there, watching me, but I can wait all night. I can wait forever if I have to." Frank and Ayanna emerged from concealment like shadows, moving with the deadly silence of predators stalking prey. Carstairs was completely focused on the house, his back turned to the chicken coop where his enemies now crouched with weapons ready. "It's over, Carstairs," Frank called out, his rifle trained on the young man's spine. Carstairs spun around, his pale eyes wide with shock and rage. For a moment, Frank thought he might surrender. The tactical situation was hopeless, and even Carstairs must have realized it. Instead, the young man raised his rifle with desperate speed, swinging the barrel toward Ayanna. "If I can't have her, nobody can." Frank's shot and Carstairs' fired almost simultaneously. Frank felt the wind of the bullet pass his ear as his own round took Carstairs in the chest, spinning him backward into the water trough. The young man's rifle flew from his hands, clattering across the packed earth of the yard. Carstairs lay motionless in the moonlight, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the stars. Frank felt no satisfaction in the kill, only a weary relief that the immediate threat was ended. But he knew this was just the beginning. Other men would come, drawn by rumors of treasure and the challenge to territorial power that the land grants represented. Nashotah and his warriors emerged from the desert like materializing spirits. The Apache leader was a man of perhaps 50 years, his face seamed by wind and sun, his dark eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of countless battles. He looked first at Carstairs' body, then at Frank and Ayanna, his expression unreadable. "Cousin," he said to Ayanna, his voice carrying the warmth of family recognition. "Nashotah," she replied, moving forward to embrace him. They spoke rapidly in their own language, and Frank caught enough words to understand that she was explaining the situation, the treasure, the land grants, the larger implications of what they had discovered. When the conversation ended, Nashotah turned his attention to Frank. The Apache leader studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential ally or enemy. "My cousin says you are a good man," he said in accented but clear English. "But you bought her freedom and treated her with honor." "She's earned her freedom a dozen times over," Frank replied. "And she saved my life more than once during this journey." Nashotah nodded slowly. "She also says you carry papers that could change the fate of all our peoples." Frank glanced at Ayanna, who nodded encouragingly. Carefully, he unwrapped the leather bundle and showed Nashotah the Mexican land grants. The Apache leader examined the documents with the attention of someone who understood their significance. "These lands were stolen from my people long before the Mexicans claimed them," he said finally. "But the Mexicans at least recognized that indigenous peoples had rights. The Americans ... He gestured toward Carstairs' body. "The Americans believe in taking what they want and calling it progress." "What happens now?" Frank asked. Nashotah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the documents, Frank and his cousin. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decisions that would affect generations. "There is an Apache lawyer in Tucson," he said. "A man named Joseph Crowfeather who was educated in the East but remembered where he came from. He has been fighting in the American courts for our rights, winning some cases, losing others. These papers ... double quotes. He touched the land grants reverently. "These could give him weapons more powerful than rifles." Frank felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You think the grants could be validated?" "Perhaps. The Americans claim to honor Mexican law when it serves their interests. But it will be dangerous. Men like Carstairs have friends in high places, people who profit from keeping the current system unchanged." As if summoned by his words, new dust clouds appeared on the eastern horizon. Frank's heart sank as he realized their respite was ending. More riders were approaching, whether law enforcement, more of Carstairs' allies, or simple curiosity seekers drawn by the sound of gunfire, he couldn't tell. "We need to leave," Ayanna said, reading the situation correctly. "If we're found here with Carstairs' body and a war party of Apaches, questions will be asked that we're not ready to answer." Nashota nodded agreement. "My cousin is wise. But where will you go? This ranch is no longer safe for either of you." Frank looked around at the buildings his father had constructed with sweat and dreams, at the land that had nearly killed him, trying to make it productive. Everything he had known and worked for was here, but Nashota was right, staying would mean death or imprisonment. "The lawyer in Tucson," Frank said. "If these documents can change everything, then that's where we need to be." "It's a long journey," Nashota warned. "And you'll be traveling through a country controlled by men who want you dead." "Then we'd better travel fast," Ayanna said, already moving toward the barn where their horses waited as they prepared to abandon. The Broken Wheel Ranch. Frank took one last look around the place that had been his home. The main house stood solid and defiant despite the battle damage, its thick walls scarred but unbroken. The windmill continued its endless turning, drawing water from the deep while his father had dug with his own hands. It occurred to Frank that he wasn't just leaving a place, he was leaving a way of life. The dream of making a living from this harsh land, of building something permanent in the face of the desert's indifference, was ending. But perhaps something better was beginning. The documents in his saddlebags represented more than treasure, or even legal victory. They represented the possibility of justice in a territory that had known precious little of it. They offered hope to people who had been driven from their ancestral lands and relegated to the margins of American society. As they rode away from the ranch in the company of Nashota's warriors, Frank felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a failed rancher trying to save his property. He had become the guardian of secrets that could reshape the American Southwest, and there were powerful men who would stop at nothing to prevent that from happening. The moon was rising over the eastern mountains, casting silver light across the desert landscape. Behind them, the approaching riders were still miles away, their dust clouds visible but not yet threatening. Ahead lay Tucson and the uncertain prospect of legal battle against entrenched interests. But for the first time in months, Frank felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would not face them alone. Ayanna rode beside him, her presence a constant reminder that courage and wisdom could triumph over greed and cruelty. And somewhere in the city they were riding toward, an Apache lawyer waited who might have the skills to turn their dangerous secrets into transformative justice. The desert night embraced them as they began their journey toward an uncertain but potentially revolutionary future, carrying with them the power to right historical wrongs and the determination to see justice done, whatever the cost. The journey to Tucson stretched across 5 days of punishing desert travel, through a country that seemed determined to test the resolve of any fool hardy enough to cross it. Frank had thought he knew hardship from his struggles at the ranch, but this trek revealed new depths of endurance he'd never suspected he possessed. Nashota's warriors moved through the landscape like smoke, appearing and vanishing among the saguaro forests and rocky outcroppings with an ease that made Frank feel clumsy by comparison. They traveled mostly at night, resting during the brutal daylight hours in whatever shade they could find, abandoned mine shafts, natural caves, or simply the meager shadows cast by desert vegetation. The Apache leader had insisted on this nocturnal schedule after receiving disturbing news from his scouts. Word of the battle at Broken Wheel Ranch had spread faster than wildfire through the territory's network of traders, drifters, and bounty hunters. Carstairs might be dead, but his associates in Tucson and Phoenix were already organizing search parties, offering substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of the Indian woman and her accomplice. "They're calling you an outlaw now," Nashota informed Frank during their second day of travel, as they sheltered in a cave system north of the Dragoon Mountains. "The territorial governor has issued a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder, theft, and inciting Indian uprising." Frank felt his stomach clench. "Murder? Carstairs attacked us. It was self-defense." "Truth is a luxury in territorial politics," Nashota replied grimly. "Carstairs had wealthy friends who are rewriting the story to suit their purposes. According to the official version, you and Ayanna robbed his archaeological expedition and killed him when he tried to recover stolen Apache artifacts." Ayanna spat into the dust at her feet. "Archaeological expedition? That bastard never saw an artifact that wasn't attached to a woman he wanted to own." "Nevertheless," Nashota continued, "the lie serves their purposes. It justifies military action against any Apache band suspected of harboring you, and it gives them legal cover to seize whatever treasure they believe you've discovered." Frank studied the leather bundle that never left his side, its weight seeming to increase with each mile they traveled. The Mexican land grants were more dangerous than dynamite, powerful enough to reshape the territorial power structure, but only if they could survive long enough to present them in court. "Tell me about this lawyer," Frank said. "Joseph Crow. Feather, can we trust him?" Nashota's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "He is my wife's nephew, trained in the white man's law schools, but raised to remember his ancestors. He has won cases that everyone said were impossible, forced the territorial courts to acknowledge Apache water rights, and secured compensation for families whose land was stolen by railroad companies. And he's still alive?" Frank asked, surprised that such a successful native advocate hadn't met with an unfortunate accident. "Crow Feather is careful," Nashota explained. "He works within the system, always following proper procedures, making himself too visible to eliminate quietly. And he has allies, other lawyers, journalists, even some politicians who believe justice should apply to all peoples, not just the wealthy." As they traveled deeper into the desert, Frank found himself increasingly impressed by Ayanna's resilience. She seemed to draw strength from the harsh landscape, reading signs in wind patterns and animal behavior that helped them avoid both natural hazards and human pursuit. When water ran low, she located hidden springs that didn't appear on any map. When supplies dwindled, she supplemented their rations with desert plants that Frank would never have recognized as edible. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked during their third night on the trail, as she prepared a meal from prickly pear pads, mesquite beans, and a rabbit one of the warriors had killed. "From my grandmother," Ayanna replied, her hands working efficiently in the firelight. "She lived through the time when our people were first driven from their traditional territories. She said knowledge of the land was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen." Frank thought about his own grandmother, a Pennsylvania farm woman who had died when he was 12. Her knowledge had been different: how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to read weather signs in the behavior of domestic animals, how to stretch a dollar through lean times. But the principle was the same: practical wisdom passed down through generations, teaching survival in whatever world circumstances created. On the fourth day, their careful progress was interrupted by news that changed everything. One of Nashota's scouts returned from a reconnaissance mission with information that made the Apache leader's face darken with anger. "Federal troops," the scout reported in rapid Apache, with Ayanna translating for Frank. "2 companies of cavalry. Maybe 60 men camped at Dragoon Springs. They're searching every ranch, every mine, every settlement between here and Tucson." "Looking for us?" Frank asked. "Looking for something," Nashota confirmed. "But that's not the worst news. They're not alone." The scout continued his report, and Frank watched Ayanna's expression grow increasingly grim as she listened. "Railroad surveyors," she translated. 3 teams of them, mapping every mile between Phoenix and the Mexican border. They're working under military protection, which means the railroad extension is definitely coming, Frank finished. And they want to make sure there are no legal obstacles in their path. Nashota nodded grimly. The timing is not coincidental. Carstairs' death has accelerated their schedule. They know you carry documents that could complicate their plans, so they're moving fast to establish facts on the ground before those documents can be presented in court. Frank felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. Somewhere ahead, railroad companies and their political allies were racing to lock in land claims worth millions of dollars. Behind them, search parties were scouring the desert with orders to prevent any challenge to those claims from reaching legal authority. "We need to reach Tucson tonight," he said. "Impossible," Nashota replied. "We're still 20 miles out, and the country between here and there is crawling with patrols." "Then what do you suggest?" The Apache leader was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks that surrounded their destination. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "We separate," he said finally. "My warriors and I will create diversions, draw the patrols away from the main routes. You and Ayana will travel alone, moving fast and light, using paths that only someone with her knowledge of the desert could navigate." Frank felt his stomach drop. The prospect of crossing 20 miles of hostile territory without Nashota's protection seemed like suicide. But he could see the logic in the plan. A large group would be easier to spot and track, while two people might slip through gaps in the military cordon. "What about after we reach Tucson?" Ayana asked. "If Crow Feather agrees to take the case, he'll need time to prepare legal arguments, file motions, gather supporting evidence. That could take weeks or months. Then you'll need to disappear," Nashota said. "Find safe places to hide while the legal process unfolds. Crow Feather has allies who can provide shelter, but it won't be comfortable or certain." As evening approached, they prepared for the separation that might be permanent. Nashota's warriors shared their remaining supplies, pressing extra ammunition and water on Frank and Ayana. The Apache leader himself gave Frank a beaded medicine bag that had belonged to his grandfather. "For protection," he explained. "The spirits of this land are old and powerful. They remember when justice meant something." Frank accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved, understanding that he was being entrusted with more than material objects. He was carrying the hopes of people who had been fighting for survival and dignity for generations. As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Frank and Ayana set out on their final approach to Tucson. They traveled on foot now, leading their horses to minimize noise and dust. The desert night enveloped them like a protective cloak, stars providing just enough light to navigate by. The first patrol they encountered was a squad of cavalry troopers, camped beside a waterhole 3 miles north of the city. Frank and Ayana crouched behind a stand of ocotillo cactus, watching the soldiers' campfire flicker in the darkness. The men seemed relaxed, confident that their quarry was still somewhere in the vast desert behind them. "We can circle around," Ayana whispered, pointing to a wash that led east toward higher ground. But as they began to move, Frank heard something that made his blood freeze, the distinctive crack of a rifle shot, followed by another, then a whole volley of gunfire from somewhere to the west. Nasota and his warriors had begun their diversionary attacks. The cavalry camp erupted into activity as officers shouted orders and troopers ran for their horses. Within minutes, the entire patrol was mounted and riding hard toward the sound of battle, leaving their campfire burning unattended. "Now," Frank said, and they led their horses quickly past the abandoned camp, but the diversion came at a cost. As they approached the outskirts of Tucson, they could see fires burning in the distance, not campfires, but the orange glow of buildings ablaze. The sound of sustained gunfire echoed across the desert, punctuated by the distinctive war cries of Apache warriors. "Nashotah," Ayanna whispered, her voice tight with worry. Frank understood her concern. The Apache leader was risking everything to give them this chance, drawing military attention away from Tucson at potentially terrible cost to himself and his men. The weight of that sacrifice added urgency to their mission. Tucson, in 1882, was a rough frontier town of perhaps 3,000 souls, built around a cluster of adobe buildings that had originally served as a Spanish presidio. Even at midnight, the main street showed signs of life oil lamps burning in saloon windows, the distant sound of piano music, occasional shouts from late-night revelers. Frank and Ayanna left their horses at a livery stable on the edge of town, paying the sleepy attendant extra to ask no questions about late arrivals. Then they made their way through darkened side streets toward the address Nashotah had given them for Joseph Crowfeather's office. The law office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story adobe building on Congress Street, its windows dark at this late hour. But Nashotah had told them that Crowfeather lived in rooms above his practice, and Frank could see lamplight showing through curtained windows on the upper floor. They climbed external stairs to a wooden balcony, and Frank knocked softly on the door. Footsteps approached from within, accompanied by the metallic click of a pistol being cocked. "Who's there?" a voice demanded in English heavily accented with Apache inflections. "Friends of Nashotah," Frank replied, using the phrase the Apache leader had told them would serve as introduction. The door opened to reveal a man in his 30s, of medium height with intelligent dark eyes and black hair worn shorter than traditional Apache style. He was dressed in the formal attire of a successful lawyer: white shirt, dark trousers, vest, but Frank could see the outline of a shoulder holster beneath his coat. "Joseph Crowfeather," the man said, extending his hand. "And you must be Thomas." "Garrett and Ayanna. Nashotah sent word that you might be coming." "You know about the battle?" Ayanna asked as they were ushered inside. Crowfeather's expression grew grim. "The whole territory knows by now. Telegraph lines have been buzzing all evening with reports of Apache raids. The military commander is talking about declaring martial law." Frank felt his stomach sink. "We never intended for this to escalate." "So far, escalation was inevitable," Crowfeather replied, gesturing for them to sit at a table that served as both dining surface and desk. "The forces you've set in motion were already building pressure. Carstairs' death and your escape simply provided the spark." The lawyer poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on a small stove, and Frank noticed that the man's hands were steady despite the late hour and dramatic circumstances. This was someone accustomed to crisis, trained to think clearly under pressure. "Nashotah says you carry documents that could change everything," Crowfeather continued. "May I see them?" Frank unwrapped the leather bundle with reverent care, spreading the Mexican land grants across the table. Crowfeather examined each document with the meticulous attention of someone trained to read legal language in multiple languages. His expression grew increasingly interested as he studied the seals, signatures, and official stamps. "Remarkable," he murmured finally. "These grants cover nearly 50,000 acres of prime territory, including most of the Verde River Valley and significant portions of what is now claimed by 3 different railroad companies." "Are they legitimate?" Frank asked. "Oh, they're legitimate," Crowfeather replied without hesitation. "The signatures are genuine, the seals are correct, and the legal language follows proper Mexican territorial law. The question is whether American courts will choose to honor them." Ayanna leaned forward intently. "What do you mean, choose to honor them?" "Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, specifically states that property rights established under Mexican law would be respected by the American government. But in practice, territorial courts have found creative ways to invalidate grants when it serves the interests of American settlers and corporations." Frank felt his hopes deflating. "So these papers are worthless?" Not worthless, Crowfeather corrected, but challenging. We would need to present them in federal court rather than territorial court, argue that they represent treaty obligations rather than mere property disputes. It would be expensive, time-consuming, and politically explosive. How explosive? Ayanna asked. The lawyer stood and walked to his window, peering through the curtains at the dark street below. Explosive enough to bring down territorial governments, challenge railroad expansion plans worth tens of millions of dollars, and potentially return vast territories to native control. There are men who would start wars to prevent that. Frank understood now why Carstairs and his allies had been so desperate to recover the documents. They represented more than money. They represented a fundamental challenge to the power structure that had governed the American Southwest since the Mexican conquest. "Will you take the case?" he asked. Crowfeather was quiet for a long moment, still gazing out at the sleeping town. When he turned back to face them, his expression was resolute. "Yes," he said simply. "Not because I expect to win, the odds are heavily against us, but because some fights are worth having even when victory seems impossible." The lawyer began outlining the legal strategy he would pursue, the federal courts where the case might be heard, the supporting evidence they would need to gather. But his words were interrupted by the sound of horses in the street, below many horses, moving at a quick trot through the midnight darkness. Crowfeather extinguished his lamp and returned to the window. Frank and Ayanna joined him, peering through gaps in the curtains at the scene unfolding below. A full troop of cavalry was surrounding the building, soldiers dismounting with weapons ready. At their head rode a figure Frank recognized with a sick feeling in his stomach, Colonel Marcus Webb, the territorial military commander, a man known for his harsh methods in dealing with Apache resistance. "They found us," Ayanna whispered, but Crowfeather seemed strangely calm. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they're simply conducting the kind of search they've been running all evening. Either way, we need to prepare for the possibility that this meeting is ending before it's properly begun." The lawyer moved quickly around his office, gathering specific documents and papers into a leather portfolio. "These are copies of precedent cases, legal arguments I've been developing for months in anticipation of a case like this. If something happens to me, other lawyers can continue the work." Frank felt the weight of impending disaster. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, only to be trapped at the moment when legal salvation seemed within reach. "Is there another way out?" he asked. Crowfeather nodded toward a door at the back of the room. "Stairs to the alley behind the building. But they'll have men posted there too, if they're being thorough." Heavy footsteps echoed from the external staircase as soldiers climbed toward the office door. Colonel Webb's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Mr. Crowfeather, this is Colonel Webb, Territorial Military Command. I need to speak with you on a matter of urgent security." The lawyer looked at Frank and Ayanna, his expression conveying a message without words. This was the moment of decision surrender and hope for legal process, or run and become permanent fugitives. Frank made the choice for all of them. "We run," he said, grabbing the precious land grants and rewrapping them in their leather covering. Crowfeather nodded and handed him the portfolio of legal documents. "Take these. Find someone who can use them if I don't survive what's coming." They moved toward the back door as the pounding on the front entrance grew more insistent. Frank could hear soldiers spreading out around the building, calling positions to each other in the military shorthand of a well-coordinated operation. The back stairs led down to a narrow alley that ran between Congress Street and the next block south. As Crowfeather had predicted, soldiers were posted at both ends of the passage, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. There, Ayanna pointed to a low roof that connected the law office building to a general store next door. "We can reach the adjacent street from there." They climbed carefully onto the flat adobe roof, moving in a crouch to avoid silhouetting themselves against the star-filled sky. Behind them, They could hear the front door of the office being broken open, followed by Webb's harsh voice demanding to know where the fugitives were hiding. The adjacent roof provided access to a different alley, one that appeared unguarded. They dropped down quietly and began working their way through the maze of back streets that connected Tucson's commercial district to the residential areas beyond. But their escape was complicated by the systematic nature of the military search. Webb had deployed his men with professional efficiency, creating overlapping zones of coverage that made movement increasingly difficult. Every time they approached a main street, they found patrols waiting. "The church," Ayanna whispered as they crouched behind a blacksmith's shop, watching soldiers pass 20 yards away. "St. Augustine Cathedral, it might offer sanctuary." Frank nodded, remembering stories of churches providing refuge for fugitives in the old days. It was worth trying, though he suspected that Colonel Webb would have little respect for religious tradition if it interfered with his mission. They made their way through darkened residential streets toward the cathedral, a massive adobe structure that dominated Tucson's skyline. The building was dark except for votive candles flickering in the windows, but the heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar. Inside, the cathedral was a sanctuary of shadows and whispered prayers. A few elderly Mexican women knelt in the front pews, their lips moving in silent devotion. The priest, a small man with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up from his evening prayers as Frank and Ayanna approached the altar. "Father," Frank whispered, "we need help." The priest studied their faces in the candlelight, reading desperation and exhaustion in their expressions. "You are the ones the soldiers seek," he said in accented English. It was not a question. Frank nodded, too tired for deception. "We carry information that could bring justice to this territory. But there are powerful men who will kill to prevent that information from reaching the courts." The priest was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving. "Between Frank and Ayanna, justice," he repeated slowly. "A word that means different things to different people." "It means giving back stolen land to its rightful owners," Ayanna said firmly. "It means holding accountable men who grow rich by taking what doesn't belong to them." Something in her words seemed to resonate with the priest. He nodded slowly and gestured toward a door beside the altar. "There are rooms beneath the church where you can rest safely. In the morning we will speak of what justice requires." As they followed the priest into the sanctuary of the cathedral's hidden chambers, Frank felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. They had found temporary safety, but the forces arrayed against them were vast and determined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, surrounded by the whispered prayers of the faithful and the weight of centuries-old stone walls, they would rest and prepare for whatever dawn might bring. The land grants remained safe in their leather wrapping, and the dream of justice remained alive despite the dangers that surrounded it. Outside, Colonel Webb's soldiers continued their systematic search of the sleeping town, unaware that their quarry had found sanctuary in the one place where even military authority hesitated to trespass. The battle for the future of the American Southwest had reached a temporary stalemate, but the war was far from over. Dawnlight filtered through the cathedral's stained glass as Frank and Ayanna prepared for what might be their final gambit. Father Martinez had brought disturbing news. Colonel Webb had declared martial law, and Joseph Crow Feather had been arrested during the night raids. "There's one possibility left," the priest said gravely. "Judge Harrison Blackwood arrives this afternoon for circuit court. He's the only man in the territory with authority to challenge federal treaty violations." Frank remembered Blackwood from the auction, the honest judge who had validated his $1 bid. "You think he'll listen?" Blackwood has forced railroad companies to honor Mexican land grants before. But reaching him won't be easy with Webb's soldiers everywhere. Father Martinez outlined their desperate plan. They would enter the courthouse through service passages just as the afternoon session began. presenting themselves as citizens seeking emergency federal jurisdiction rather than fugitives in hiding. Once Blackwood examines those documents, the priest explained, military authority becomes secondary to the judicial process. But you'll have only minutes before Webb realizes what's happening. They spent the morning rehearsing their legal arguments. Ayanna's knowledge of her father's business dealings, combined with Frank's understanding of territorial politics, to create a compelling case for the grant's legitimacy. As they prepared to leave the cathedral sanctuary, Frank studied Ayanna's determined face. "Whatever happens, I'm glad we tried." "Justice isn't about trying," she replied firmly. "It's about succeeding when others say it's impossible." Father Martinez led them through back alleys toward the courthouse, avoiding military patrols through neighborhoods where his parishioners provided cover. The two-story adobe building loomed ahead, bristling with armed guards at every entrance. A sympathetic janitor allowed them access through the basement service door. They climbed narrow stairs to emerge in the main courtroom just as Judge Blackwood called the afternoon session to order. The white-haired judge looked up from his papers, recognition flickering in his sharp eyes. "Mr. Garrett, an unexpected appearance." Frank approached the bench, the leather bundle trembling in his hands. "Your Honor, we request emergency federal jurisdiction over treaty-related property disputes." "Indeed?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose with interest. "What manner of disputes?" Frank unwrapped the Mexican land grants with reverent care, spreading the ancient documents across the judge's table. "Property deeds issued under Mexican territorial authority, affecting current railroad construction in the Verde River Valley." "Judge." Blackwood leaned forward, immediately grasping the document's significance. His trained eye examined seals, signatures, and legal language with growing amazement. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "These appear authentic, properly executed Mexican grants predating American territorial claims." Ayanna stepped forward confidently. "They belong to my father, Your Honor, a trading chief who acquired legitimate land rights before the conquest. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, these grants should be honored by American courts. The treaty indeed requires recognition of pre-existing Mexican property rights." Blackwood agreed, studying the documents more carefully. "These grants, if validated, would affect thousands of acres currently claimed by railroad companies." A military officer in the back row suddenly stood and hurried toward the exit, clearly intending to alert Colonel Webb. Frank's stomach clenched as their narrow window of opportunity began closing. "Judge." Blackwood noticed the officer's departure. His expression grew stern as he continued examining the grants. "The legal implications are enormous. Railroad companies have invested millions based on territorial land claims that may be fundamentally invalid." "Which is why we've been hunted across the territory," Ayanna said boldly. "Powerful interests prefer murder to legitimate legal challenges." The courtroom doors exploded open as Colonel Webb burst in with armed soldiers, their boots thundering on wooden floors. The military commander's face was purple with rage. "Your Honor," Webb shouted, "these individuals are wanted fugitives guilty of inciting Indian rebellion and theft of territorial artifacts. I demand their immediate arrest." Judge Blackwood rose. Slowly, his full judicial authority focusing on the military officer. "Colonel Webb, this is a federal courtroom. Military commanders do not interrupt judicial proceedings." "I've declared martial law," Webb snarled. "These criminals must be taken into custody immediately." "What you have declared, Colonel, is irrelevant to federal court jurisdiction," Blackwood replied coldly. "I am examining documents that appear to represent treaty obligations of the United States government. Any interference constitutes obstruction of federal judicial process." Webb stepped forward aggressively, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "You're exceeding your authority, Judge." "Am I?" Blackwood's voice carried the steel of absolute conviction. "These Mexican land grants, if authenticated, establish property rights protected by international treaty. Their examination falls clearly within federal jurisdiction, regardless of any territorial martial law. The judge held up one of the grants, its official seals catching the afternoon light. I am therefore issuing a temporary restraining order against all railroad construction in the Verde River Valley pending full federal review of these claims. I also order the immediate release of Joseph Crow Feather and any other individuals detained in connection with this matter. Webb's face went from purple to white. You cannot, what I can and cannot do, Colonel, is defined by the Constitution of the United States, not by territorial military commanders, Blackwood interrupted sharply. Federal judges derive their authority from constitutional law, which supersedes local martial law declarations. The confrontation that followed became legendary in territorial legal history. Judge Blackwood's absolute refusal to be intimidated by armed force demonstrated that American legal principles could triumph even in frontier circumstances. Webb eventually withdrew his soldiers, but not before promising that the matter was far from over. However, the precedent had been established. Within hours, word spread throughout the territory that the federal judicial authority had successfully challenged military rule. The legal battle that followed lasted 18 months, with appeals working through federal courts to Washington, D.C., but Judge Blackwood's initial ruling held firm. The Mexican land grants were validated under treaty law, forcing railroad companies to negotiate compensation agreements with Apache representatives. Joseph Crow Feather, released from military custody, became the legal architect of a settlement that established lasting precedents for Native American property rights. The Apache bands received substantial compensation for lands illegally seized, while Frank and Ayanna used their share to purchase fertile acres in the Verde River Valley. They built a trading post that served both Native communities and Anglo settlers, creating a bridge between cultures previously separated by suspicion and violence. Their marriage, performed by Father Martinez in the cathedral that had sheltered them, symbolized the possibility of different peoples building shared futures. Years later, when Arizona achieved statehood, Frank would reflect on that desperate auction in Copper Ridge as the moment his real life began. Not because he had rescued Ayanna, she had been strong enough to save herself, but because her courage had inspired him to become worthy of the sacrifices others had made. The abandoned Broken Wheel Ranch became a historical landmark, its windmill still turning in desert winds. It served as a reminder that dreams deferred are not dreams denied, but dreams waiting for the right moment and people to make them real. Their story became a territorial legend, a failed rancher and Apache woman who refused to accept that power always conquers principle. It was told wherever people gathered who still believed individual courage could change the world. In the desert country they had learned to love. Under endless skies, their descendants continued building the society their ancestors had dreamed of but never lived to see, a place where justice meant something real, and freedom belonged to everyone willing to fight for it. The last stand at Broken Wheel Ranch had ended not in defeat, but in transformation, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from refusing to stop fighting for what's right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.